At 14, I was a boarder in a school in the Appenzell. This was the area where Robert Walser used to take his many walks when he was in the mental hospital in Herisau, not far from our college. He died in the snow. Photographs show his footprints and the position of his body in the snow. We didn't know the writer, and nor did our literature teacher. Sometimes I think it might be nice to die like that, after a walk, to let yourself drop into a natural grave in the snows of the Appenzell, after almost 30 years of mental hospital in Herisau. It really is a shame we didn't know of Walser's existence. We would have picked a flower for him. So the opening few lines there from Fleur Jaeggy's Sweet Days of Discipline, which was originally published in 1989 as I Biti Anni del Castigo. And it was then translated, and this is the same translation, translated by Tim Parks. It was then published by New Directions in 93, and then now this edition, which is the 2018 edition, by And Other Stories publisher, but still the same translation by Tim Parks. And the reason I came across Jaeggy's work was because of a previous guest, Steve Dowden. After our discussion on the work of Thomas Bernhard, he recommended me a few books and writers, and one of which was Fleur Jaeggy, who was eventually met, and I believe an acquaintance, if not a friend, of Thomas Bernhard and Ingeborg Bachmann. And so I went into this book with sort of stylistic expectations, temperament expectations, and they were ultimately fulfilled. That's not to say her work is exactly like Bernhard or Bernhardian, though it is in some respects. But the way I would describe Sweet Days of Discipline, which seems to be her most well-known and well-respected book, is, without seeming like a complete cliche, is an icy dagger of a book. It comes in this translation at 101 pages, and what happens in the time that you are reading the book is rather strange for a book of 101 pages. And I say this a lot when I read short books. That's why I like really short books, because they often manage to do things with that compression and that limitation, which otherwise get drawn out and get messed around with. And so in just 101 pages, you feel as if you have quite literally spent days upon days reading this book, because of the protagonists, this nameless protagonist, woman talking about her past, reminiscing, maybe nostalgically, but with heaps and heaps of melancholy and distance. It's an extremely distant narrator. From the future, talking about her past in a very oppressive boarding school. The crux of the book is ultimately 101 pages of sort of scenes and atmospherics surrounding what happens to a child's mind, approach to the world, vitality, and engagement with the world when they are placed within an impressive and oppressive environment such as the boarding school that we are given with this book, one that demands obedience, etiquette, and ultimately submission. And the question that one has at the end of the book with regards to how the narrator speaks and narrates her past from this extreme distance, even though she is explicitly, clearly understanding that it was an oppressive childhood, is whether or not these situations, this history, these events, have intruded truly internally, and whether or not there is something that is perhaps retrievable in terms of the glimpses of vitality that we see attempting to come through in a sort of childlike freedom. And this is all held up by a crystalline, frosty, medicinal, explicit, almost hyper-empirical in the sense of a straining towards the fewest words possible for description, yet allowing prose to come through. Just like an icicle. His prose is cutting to the point where the whole of time, at least for the first half, there is this sort of speeding up near the end in a way. An energy comes in which is bitter. But at least for the first half, Jaeggy's ability to utilize prose to absolutely slow you down and feel weighted down and cold and damp and drained, and yet at the same time feeling such compassion for anyone who is also in this situation which the prose has momentarily drawn you into. And every once in a while, I will read a book, and the language and the style of which will make me think, wow, ultimately think this is what great literature can do. And the more you read, the less that happens because of the more you read. But occasionally you find something extremely original. And actually there is, on the back, a quote by Gabe Habash, who I don't know who that is, but I thought his quote about the book was quite perfect. Like all great books, it's really like nothing else. It's like itself. And it is one of a kind in its style, in its purpose. And so, one more reading and then I'll get more explicitly to the plot that there is. One day I found a little love note in my pigeonhole. It was from a 10-year-old who begged me to let her become my favorite, to make a pair. Impulsively I answered with an unfriendly no, and I still regret it today. I regretted it then, too, immediately, no sooner than I'd told her that I had no use for a sister, that I wasn't interested in looking after a little favorite. I was getting to be unpleasant because Frederique was eluding me, and I had to conquer her, because it would be too humiliating to lose. I only took a look at the younger girl when it was too late. I had already offended her. She was really pretty, very attractive. I had lost a slave without getting any pleasure out of it. I'll come back to why I've highlighted that little excerpt, but ultimately, as I've said, this is a 101-page book that is told in a melancholic, retrospective style that leaves one questioning, in elusive questions where the narrator, where she is now, why she would, what's her purpose in addressing and putting this down on paper in a certain sense. But it revolves around this unnamed narrator, as I've said, telling us about her boarding school days, or telling almost nothing about her boarding school days, writing down these, not necessarily quips, not aphorisms or anything like that, but writing down these scenes with the utmost bitterness and pristine attention, like a sort of caustic diary. So during her boarding school days, she then forms an intense friendship, a love, but as we can see from that passage, there's such the atmosphere of this oppressive boarding school that requires really ultimately submission for you to be ground down, and your youth and adolescence and your love and care and affection is pushed out of your being. That this friendship that is forged with this with Frederique, it's more than a friendship in the sense that it's very likely a form of love, but because of this intrusion from the boarding school, that in its purest sense isn't allowed to really blossom. And so we see words there like, slave, and this usage of everything and anything to the end goals of the school, which is this sort of obedience and oppressive atmosphere. Frederique is this sort of austere French girl with who is always in complete, natural, organic obedience with the disciplines and the rigor of the school, as if she's almost a sort of an angel-like figure within that domain. She can give herself over to those disciplines, to that obedience, to that atmosphere of austere rigor and submission in a way that comes natural to her. One that our narrator is at times almost jealous of, watching Frederique fold her clothes perfectly and things along these lines. Frederique in that way displays no emotion. She is a being of such environments. And the narrator, who at all times is not at all times, but is in a way trying to question whether or not she should give herself over to either this sort of freedom that is a remnant of what we might call an innocent, pure childhood and adolescence, filled with freedom and love and affection and joy, which is in a way the silent other of the whole book. Is the thing we know that is missing that should be there. And yet at the same time, Frederique is this figure there that has no human emotion. She is a being of this submission, as I've said. So the narrator is wishing to exit and be free and start her real life, but at the same time she is strangely attractive and ultimately in love with the disciplined, rigorous, austere nature of Frederique, who the narrator then attempts a sort of conquest of Frederique. She wants to win. She wants to succeed, and ultimately, I think, in a way, wants to dominate. And so this is the ultimate question of, has anything of not in any overly romantic way, but has anything of a pure desire, one filled with joy and openness, been retained, and youth and vitality been retained, or has the atmosphere which one feels through the prose intruded into the characters so much that they ultimately now seek only to dominate and discipline and rule others? However, the narrator is sort of consumed by this engagement with Frederique for a long time until Micheline arrives at the school, who wears sort of this strange counterpart, but never comes across as cliche, wears colourful clothes, is carefree, sort of this strange opposite, though this isn't really projected in any binary moral or aesthetic sense, once again in the sense that because we've had this backdrop with the prose, with the style, with the temporality, which is slow and grinding and icy, and empirically with the boarding school, these two characters, Frederique and Micheline, on sort of ends of the spectrum of freedom and expression and discipline and asceticism, aren't presented as ultimately stereotypes. Everything has been tainted by this frost, like a layer of it's like trying to find joy or trying to understand a question, or work out a question, or work out one's purpose or meaning, or what one truly wants at 5 o'clock in the morning when you're breathing in icy air and you're just trying to get warm. At all times, about 60% of your energy is just going towards that, like wading through a frost, trying to figure things out. And everything has been infected parasitically by that. And so in that same sense, everybody becomes competitive and dominatory and bitter, ultimately. But the narrator, frustrated by her inability to sort of transform Frederique into that of her wanting, drops her conquest, and then soon after, Frederique's father dies. She's taken out of school, and the narrator spends the rest of her life regretting having ended this friendship. Now, this all seems quite vague. There are explicit characters, and there is also a concentration on father figures throughout the book. But one thing to say is that with this temporality, with this sort of frosty quagmire, as I describe it, but with strange enough little snippets and blades of beauty that keep one intrigued, is that these characters, it's jarring in a positive sense that things are stopped and we move forward. Things are stopped and we move forward. And so Frederic, Michelin, the fathers, the members of the school, all these characters are themselves like backdrops. They appear and they just disappear. They in a way, they freeze and then they thaw out and they disappear once again into this sort of nothingness. And it's at this point that you remember, and because the perspectives are done so well, it's at this point and at those points when things are just disappearing and reappearing that you remember that this is a reminiscence, that this is a narrator looking back upon her life when she was younger. And ultimately, this whole thing is, at that point, sort of nihilistic. The question of why to relive this. Is someone reliving this who themselves has actually been completely ruined by that which we've experienced with the book so far? So, one more reading, and then I'll go into a few more of a couple of readings, then I'll go into a few more of the details. Did Frederic have a double life? Her conversations with me were not only profound, and I must admit here that sometimes they sapped my energy, but some of her ideas, perhaps because of the complete freedom with which she expressed them, were not strictly and safely orthodox. I was ignorant, as I have said. Frederic gave me the impression, and I know this word makes people smile, of being a nihilist. This made her all the more intriguing to me. A nihilist with no passion, with her gratuitous laugh, a gallows laugh. I'd already heard the word at home one holiday spoken with scorn. When Frederic drew me into that kind of conversation, which in any event I admired, there was an atmosphere of punishment, an absence of lightness. She was not frivolous. Her face was as though honed, the flesh covering the bones became sharp. I thought of her as of a sickle moon in an oriental sky. While the people sleep, she cuts off their heads. She was eloquent. She didn't talk about justice, nor about good and evil, concepts I had heard from teachers and fellow boarders ever since I set foot in my first school at 8 years old. Then going through to about halfway in, Frederic was likewise asleep while I took my walks. The crows flew low over the steep grassy slopes, hideous, boastful, cruel. I had compared them to our adolescents as they searched for a place in the earth around the school to sink their claws into. In half an hour I was already high above, filling my lungs with the cold air. The universe seemed mute. I didn't want Frederic, nor thought about her. She read at night. Perhaps she had only just fallen asleep. In the morning she was a bit stiff, shadows under her eyes. Up on the hill I was in a state you might describe as ill happiness, a state that required solitude, a state of exhilaration and quiet selfishness, a cheerful vendetta. I had the impression that this exhilaration was an initiation, that the sickness in the happiness was due to a magical novitiate, a rite. Then it went wrong. I didn't feel anything particular anymore. Every landscape constructed its own niche and shut itself away there. The boredom of children is pure desperation. Generally, they say, children amuse themselves with next to nothing, and one wonders what that next to nothing might be. Or they amuse themselves with nothing at all. And what was that nothing at all that no longer amused the little black? The hanged men go ding-dong, says the refrain of an old American song. The little girl didn't sing or talk to herself. Sometimes she skipped in the yard, lifting a thin knee, or she ran around in a circle. We all have to bear and atone for the games that were not our own. A bit of a sleepwalker, she let her spirit rove. Shortly before Christmas, amidst the candles, they asked her to sing Stille Nacht. Frau Hofstetter pushed her into the middle of the room. The French teacher was sitting at the piano with her squat, masculine hands. The little girl turned her old woman's eyes to our tables. She looked like the last of her race. The candlelight streaked her pupils. She sang in a thin voice, a voice that came from a body that wasn't her own, disinterred. Frau Hofstetter clapped vigorously and kissed her forehead. Mein kind, she whispered, and caressed her hair, her thin pigtails, her shoulders, her narrow little body and flared skirt. She counted the fingers of her hand as if she were a doll. The girl let herself be caressed like a corpse. So we can see from those 3 excerpts, the atmosphere, once again, the constraint, the discipline, ultimately the abuse, the submissive attitude, the demands, doesn't necessarily bowl over and constrain in the sense of a violent holding down or a prison-like atmosphere. It is something instantiated so young, and the book at its sort of birth and origin, opening like a childhood, narrated from the future, from someone who had that childhood. We see that the person who is retelling the tale of their childhood is, of course, the person who has been ruined and defouled and dominated by the very same childhood that they were and are narrating. And so, if we are to have not necessarily a task, because it's difficult to avoid being caught up in or wanting just to get away from the ice and the coldness of this book, the task is to perhaps try and find some glimpses there of that unnamed narrator prior to this infiltration. And so, as the book goes on, and the narration and the reminiscing speeds up, as it does, there is a borderline sadistic enjoyment, or even masochistic enjoyment on behalf of the narrator in the fact of their engagement. And it's as it goes on, you see just how ruined they've been by the discipline, which devolves into a sort of strange, cold madness. Not where they're going to be violent or hostile to anyone, but as in the case of the landscapes closing themselves off to their own niche, a complete disengagement from life because of a need and a requirement when young to have to submit to something to such a degree that what is taken from someone in that adolescence and that childhood can never be retrieved, or possibly can't ever be retrieved. Everything leaves and enters as if nothing has happened. Everything is closed off. The narrator is extremely distant, and these loves and interests with Frederic and Michelin seem like games, seem like tasks, seem like endeavors to bide the time within this oppressive atmosphere. Because as I read when I read the earlier section with respect to the narrator's regret at not helping the young girl who needed help, that was an innocent, sort of joyous young child needing a sister, needing a help. It wasn't a game to get someone through. It would be admitting too much to the oppressive atmosphere. Everything becomes something of conquering and dominating and submitting and playing the right games. And it's all around control and obedience and fate. The fate of this narrator who, by the end, we struggle to relate to as much as we did at the beginning, I think. And throughout the whole thing, these early glimmers of wanting to get out, wanting to exit, wanting to find that freedom which is innate and inherent within all, young children and teenagers, this impatience that she had. The narration itself, this retelling from years past, just hints enough at the notion that she may very well miss that atmosphere, miss the discipline, miss the control, miss being controlled, and miss being somewhere where it was right to control people, where things were defined. Now she's at a loss, but I think she ultimately can be forgiven in a sense, because this sort of caustic, masochistic nostalgia that she has, she is the one who has been defiled by this school. It's truly an extraordinary book. It's extremely unique. Yeah, to repeat the cliche, ice, just like a dagger, like ice cold. And the reason I really love it is I'm no fan of school. And though I didn't go to a boarding school, something about the certain excerpts of the oppressive nature, which is usually absolutely indescribable, of what school can be like in its most palpable domination and conquest-like attitudes, what it begets in people to bring out the worst and then throws them into the world, to quote Bernhard, like monsters. Jaeggy has an ability with her prose, with her style, to bring that to the fore in 2 or 3 lines, and it's really quite remarkable. It's a short read, though I wouldn't say it's short in time. It's short as in 101 pages, but it took me a little longer than I thought it would. You could read in one sitting, and I think in retrospect it would have been best for me to read it in one sitting. But as you know, I like to do with these book reviews, I always like to think of times and places where it would be apt to read this. I would say winter, most certainly. If you were to read this on a summer day, the contradiction just wouldn't make sense. Absolutely, this is a cold book, or late autumn, or not necessarily a good rain, a miserable rain. Early morning, very early morning, or very late at night, definitely not in the middle of the day. Tuck yourself away and read it. But truly unique and remarkable prose. That is my short review of Fleur Jaeggy's Sweet Days of Discipline. Thanks for listening.